Okay, so I'm going to go over the presentation for my dissertation defense that was 2 days ago. Failed to hit the record button, and so I thought I would put together the slide presentation so that those who missed it and were interested in catching it could check it out. So this study was a dissertation at California Institute of Integral Studies. It was for a PsyD degree, psychological doctorate, and Katie McGovern was the chair, and Bob Noon was the external reviewer. And so the study itself was asking about the role of theory in behavior in general, in behavioral systems, behavioral units, potentially even beyond biology, but it was really focusing on biological systems, and in particular the role of valid theory in clinical psychology, and so also psychiatry. So first thing I'm going to do is go through the study itself. Then I'm going to go through the give a summary and a takeaway so that there's a single point of reference to organize the specialized or the more complex information that's going to come after that. I'm going to go through some guidelines for natural systems models in the third section, and then a ninth concept of Bowen theory, which is a more speculative section, and I'll explain that when I get to it. So the study is mostly organized around Bowen theory. It's taking Bowen theory as assumption, and it's asking about the role of valid theory in clinical practice in particular, and also the fact that there exists no unfalsifiable or there exists no falsifiable clinical theory that can integrate all observations from all areas of specialized research in human behavior. It's not something that we have yet. So I first came in contact with Bowen theory in 2006, and then it wasn't until 2011 that it really clicked for me. And what's interesting is that happened on a 10-day Vipassanā course. This is a meditation course that's highly structured. It was very rigorous. 10 days without any eye contact or reading or writing or anything like that. You're around people the whole time, and it has a structured routine so that you're focused literally every moment of the day, but in formal practice for about 12 hours every day, and just enough time to eat and sleep and take a few naps. Other than that, the goal is to practice continuously. And what was funny was that it's really just a scientific methodology, more or less, where you try to get objective about the physical sensations that arise in your body, and you do it through systematic methodology, if you will, to be able to understand how your individual human system works all together as an integrated unit. And I was starting to let's just say gather more evidence for what I understood to be described in Bowen theory. So I came out of that course thinking, wow, what I've learned here is so important to me, at least, and seems like it could be to the rest of society, that I should make a career change and include this in my professional life. So what was interesting was that I joined this PsyD program, and I start my coursework, and I immediately noticed that I was speaking a different language, more or less, than my peers, my professors, and even the literature. And I knew that my thinking was derived from this, whatever this thing was that I had discovered that's in common with Bowen theory and Vipassanā theory, and I wanted to figure out what that was. And so that was the hunch of the question, or that was the hunch that led to this study, is to figure out what is it that's out of sync, or that these two systems seem to have in common that might be out of sync with the way that the mainstream is thinking. and to figure out if any of that is actually true, but or if that's actually happening, or if that was just my bias. And it's the funniest thing. If you can imagine the kind of situation where you're walking down the street and you ask somebody for directions, and they send you off in one direction, and then as soon as you start going, they say, no, 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 it's this other way. And then you start going that way, and they say, no, 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 it's this other way. And you never actually get it right. And it's as if the words are correct and the grammar is correct, the way the words are organized. So you're literally speaking the same language, but the meaning that you're deriving from the conversation is out of sync with what the other person, the meaning the other person is deriving, and it's obvious in the action that you take as a result. So I was trying to figure out how this was working, what was going on there. So that's the question. The question was worded in a different way, and I won't get into that. But in its essence, it's what is it that these two systems have in common, if anything, that may be out of sync with the mainstream? And if so, is there anything that these two systems might contribute to the mainstream? So my hunch was that this disconnect went all the way to the bottom. It went to the lowest level. It wasn't just about what we were saying, but there was something deeper about the way we were thinking that was different. And in an epistemology, which is the philosophical term for the way you organize knowledge in a discipline of knowledge, the lowest level is the paradigm. And the paradigm is, at least for the sake of this conversation, is the rules that you follow that define the discipline. So it's the basic philosophical assumptions as part of it that that aren't necessarily fact. They don't necessarily even have to have any evidence, but they're at least the beginning assumptions that you use to organize the rest of the work that you do. And so once you've got a paradigm, for example, in the natural sciences, you might say that the first assumption in the paradigm of natural science is that there are laws of nature that can be understood increasingly through something called like the scientific methodology. So once you've got that assumption, then you can proceed and create any number of theories about the different aspects of nature, but the scope is nature. So everything within the scope is within the paradigm. So you can have specialists researching physical laws, you can have another specialist researching chemistry, that kind of thing. And the key is that they exist in the same paradigm because they can communicate and critique the way that they're conducting their research. They can critique methodology. And there are other paradigms. This is important because there are other paradigms that people use in studying human behavior that do not necessarily accept that first assumption of natural science. And so because there are assumptions that are not compatible, it's not always possible to even have a conversation or a conclusive conversation at the least, about what's being discovered in either domain of research, so long as there are different paradigms. So that was part of the disconnect. I'm going to get into the specifics a little bit later that I think account for that disconnect. So in the study, I more or less, I read all of the pertinent Bowen literature that pertinent to the research question. I read all the pertinent Vipassanā literature. Then I started again with the Bowen literature a second time, in some cases the third or fourth or fifth time, and went through line by line and picked out every passage that seemed pertinent to the research question and categorized them. And then I did the same thing with the Vipassanā literature and categorized those, so I had a way to systematically compare whether or not they agreed or disagreed on certain points pertinent to the question. And one of the first products that came out of this was when I went through the Bowen literature systematically. I was looking particularly in that literature for some kind of a condensation of the way that of the paradigm, of sort of the boundary markers for when you start walking, when you start leaving the paradigm, described by Bowen in particular, and some of Bowen's students, because there seemed to be an extraordinary amount of effort put into defining first assumptions and the principles for developing theory before even developing the theory. What are the rules for the discipline? But I think Bowen went further, or at least put more effort into that than any other researcher or clinician that I've been exposed to. So this is what it looked like. I had categories of passages from both literatures and both bodies of literature. This is the categories from the principles, rules, and assumptions category, which is the paradigm category. These are like the guidelines, or these are the parts of the paradigm that can pertain to many different theories, all within the same paradigm. And then in the second and third slide here, I've just got a similar breakdown for the theoretical concepts. I'm not intending to go into each one of these right now, but just to show how this was organized. So I had 2 sections for theoretical concepts because there were so many. And then within each category, I had a list of passages on the left-hand side of the spreadsheet for the Bowen literature with the information needed for a citation. And then on the right-hand side in the same category, I would have passages for the Vipassanā literature. So I had 2 levels of detail. I had the category. In this example, its responsibility for self was a principle that existed in both of them. And then I had the support or refutation in the form of specific passages from each body of literature. So I had 2 levels of detail that I could switch between. So that's what the study was. So now on to the specific information. This is going to be the takeaway, the most condensed version of the takeaway from the study, what these two had in common that I've been able to come up with. And the point here is to organize. This is the second section, and if you've got one reference point to hold on to, then it'll make it easier to understand what I go through in more detail in the third and fourth sections. So, what do they have in common here? What do I think accounts for this gap? Both theories emerged from the value of improving the human condition. However, both of them are suggesting that in order to answer that specific question, you actually have to take a big step back and you have to have a broader conversation. And answering the specific question of how to improve human well-being, let's say, or something like that, the answer actually lies in the broader conversation. And so that's a step that I think is not common in the literature. It's common enough to say, well, this isn't necessarily about psychology. That's a lot of responses I've gotten to this in the past. But that's because these two bodies of literature make this unique step back, and they look at the basic rules that a specific conversation would emerge from. And so you're actually talking about psychology the whole time. So anyway, they're both taking a big step back and say, how best to approach complex problems in general? Maybe the answer lies there. So both systems are saying, in a nutshell, in a sentence, the way you understand a problem determines what you do to solve it. So there's a lot to unpack there. Both saying the way that you understand a problem determines what you're going to do to solve it. So when you've got a problem, this graphic is just meant to depict the way that you're thinking about something. You've got a whole bunch of different variables. You've got 10, 15 variables, and they have various relationships, and they all fit together in this configuration to produce some kind of a model or an understanding of the problem. So the way you understand the problem determines what you're going to do about it. I'm just calling this a theory. I'm calling the way you understand the problem a theory. And maybe it's interchangeable with a model, but I'm going to use this word over and over and over again, theory. So this goes pretty deep, actually, I think. Particularly in Vipassanā theory, it goes all the way down the bottom past biology. Vipassanā theory mostly focuses on biology, just like Bowen theory, but it goes deeper. Bowen theory, the literature is mostly talking about clinically, when you have what you do clinically determines what you do about the problem. Like in the clinical setting, the theory that you have of the problem determines what you do about it. It's at that level. But I'm taking this a lot further. So let's think in terms that apply equally to a human, a dog, and a computer. So from complex biology to still complex but less complex biology, out of all the way through the bottom of biology into a non-living system, more or less. So if you've got a dog that reliably barks at every oncoming stranger, then you might infer the theory that is governing the dog's behavior. So you might say the assumption is that approaching strangers is a threat, and aggressive behavior will extinguish the threat. So that's a theory. It's a way to understand the problem. It's what the dog is expecting based on the contextual information. So the theory is the expectation that the behavioral unit has about the context that it will be confronted with. So let's take a second dog. Now there might be another dog who has the same theory, but in addition it has another variable. It says oncoming stranger might be a threat, or is a threat, but they also might have a doggy treat. So that's a better theory. That's a more sophisticated theory. It adapts to a broader number of cases. And maybe that's the definition for adaptation, let's say. So we've got two different theories, and one is a little bit more flexible. Nevertheless, there is it's not necessarily the program, but it's it's the expectation of the context. It's not the same thing as the instructions. Slight differentiation there. It's not an algorithm. It's not a program. It's just the information that represents the understanding of that behavioral units of the context or contexts that it will be confronted with. Okay, so outside the bottom of biology into computer systems. So same principle here. So if my job is to program to build the spell check feature in Microsoft Word, that's one piece of Microsoft Word, then the code are the instructions for how it behaves, but in effect, the code is the best theory that I have of what spell check actually is. It's my definition of spell check. This is what spell check is in this application. So it's the theory that governs the behavior. In either case, there is an understanding, there's an information state from which action is derived. And spell check behaves just like the dog behaves. And in both cases, there is some congruence, there is some degree of match between the theory of what the context will be and the actuality of the context, with the objective, factual reality of what the context will be. And in the case of the dog, the context is whether or not the stranger is a friend or a foe. And in the case of Microsoft Word, it's the person that will be clicking on it and the particular inputs and outputs. That's the context. And sometimes Microsoft Word's a little bit buggy. Sometimes the dog's theory is a little bit buggy. So there's a theory here. And now both of these theoretical systems that are theories of human behavior and beyond, but at least human behavior, are saying that the theory is everything. And so that's a particularly nuanced definition of theory, I think. Not just what we're writing down about our idea about how about how the weather works. We have a theory of the weather, scientific theory. That's like an explicit theory, though it serves the same function. I'm using this in a much broader term that goes much deeper. Okay, so like in the graphic, we've got an understanding of the problem. We've got a little bit of a model of the problem. We've got 10, 12, 15 variables, and we kind of define how they relate to each other, and we whenever we confront the problem, we go back to the theory and say, well, how does this problem work? And I'm trying to invest in the financial market, and so how do I make that decision? Well, I go back to my model, And so that's what we're talking about here. Now, both of them are saying that the degree to which your understanding, the degree to which your theory is incomplete, the degree to which it accounts for a part of the problem, so a small part of the complex, increases or influences the chances and maybe determines the chances that what you do to solve the problem will actually make the problem worse. So that's an interesting claim as well. So everything is focused on the information that guides action. And you can say that you don't have a theory, and you're writing on intuition or whatever it is, or you just feel it, or that's fine. But there's always going to be an implicit theory in there that your implicit actions or your intuitive actions are being guided by, at least in the way that I'm defining theory here. So how do you know you have a partial view? Well, one way would be that what you do to solve the problem only works part of the time. Seems logical enough. And you can't predict necessarily when it's going to work and when it's not going to work. So that means that you don't understand the whole problem. Now, one example is clozapine is the go-to treatment for schizophrenia, for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. It only works 40% of the time. Not only that, but it comes with its respective side effects. And so it works part of the time, but it's also not a perfect solution. So it's really a very partial solution. That doesn't mean that we don't understand how to control schizophrenia. That's not what I mean by theory. What I mean is that that indicates we don't know what schizophrenia is. We don't actually have a theory that describes the phenomenon prior to intervention. So that's the distinction that I'm going to keep making here, is that there's a theory of how to control something, and then there's actually a theory of what it is prior to trying to control it. And we're focusing on the second one, what it is. Okay, so hammering on one piece of the pie, hammering on a partial view, acting on a partial or incomplete or invalid view, has the potential or an increasing potential to make the problem worse, particularly over the long run. That's what both systems are saying. Now, they both account for this in an interesting way. So the basic model for natural systems, and assuming human beings are a natural system, and that's what this project is about, both systems view natural systems as counterbalancing forces. Not simply that they're a product of counterbalancing forces. They are counterbalancing forces. That's what a natural system is in their view. And just a simple example of that is that if I want, I have some kind of a force that compels me to eat ice cream because I like ice cream, but then after a while I eat too much of it, and then there's other factors that kind of take over in reciprocal fashion, and they say, okay, that's too much ice cream, you're going to get nauseous. But then it starts all over again the next day. So there's some kind of an ebb and flow. There are counterbalancing forces that regulate my functioning as a natural system. So both systems are saying that that natural systems are counterbalancing forces. That's the first assumption. And then that because natural systems are so complex, they are networks of counterbalancing factors that are related through reciprocal feedback loops. And so what does it mean if we have a partial understanding of an incredibly complex problem and we're just hammering away at that little piece that we do understand? Well, if all of the factors that hold or maintain the natural system in equilibrium are related through reciprocal feedback loops, and you hammer on one piece of it, then the effects or the repercussions of attempting to impact that small piece echo and reverberate throughout the feedback loops of the system and come back to haunt you later on, and sometimes they even make it worse. So there's examples of that to come. So the assumption is that we have complex networks of reciprocal feedback loops that maintain the system as a system. So if we've ever got any pattern in nature that persists long enough to deserve a name, that's what we mean by natural system. And then we've got a basic model that natural systems are counterbalancing forces, often very, very complex networks of counterbalancing forces. So we've got a distinction here, implicit in this model. We've got something that might be more of an engineering discipline, and I'm going to use this term incorrectly, slightly, but to make a point. We've got a discipline that is primarily oriented towards control of the phenomenon. So constructing solutions that operate or behave in a predictable way, so that we can develop treatments for diseases, so we can put a man on the moon, etc., etc., etc. An engineering discipline and a pure scientific discipline. And the pure scientific discipline is one that's organized around the development of theory that explains the natural phenomenon. So it explains how people work, explains what schizophrenia is, not just how to control it. So that's a broad step back from how to improve the human condition into the broader context of how to think about some of the factors that influence the way that we deal with complex problems in general. That's what both systems are saying. But they're saying something else. So that's all one side of the coin. And there's another factor that represents the other side of the coin of how to deal with complex problems, like emotional dysfunction, for example, or investment strategy. They're both saying something about humans in particular. Other forms of life too, but we're focused on how humans behave. They're saying that as the problem becomes more urgent, as it becomes more important, then arousal increases, you become more reactive, your ability to see the complex factors that define a problem actually decreases, and the ability to even know that you have a partial view actually decreases. So we have a snowball effect on our ability to perceive objectively. We see less dynamic processes, we see more static descriptors, the field of view we have narrows, and functionally we get into a position in an older way of functioning, a more basic biological way of functioning that has more to do with a singular action than a sophisticated long-term plan. So acting for the short term as opposed to sophistication for the long term. So what they're saying is that as the problems become more complex and more urgent, there is a greater need to focus on the other side of the coin, which is to apply the same kinds of scientific principles that you would in a pure scientific discipline to our own functioning. And not just for one person to apply them, to apply scientific principles to determine the role that other people's functioning are playing in the problem, but the way that your own functioning is playing in the problem, in the ability to solve the problem, but also in the problem itself. And that's an interesting proposition. They're saying that maybe a lot of the problems that we have, or some of the problems, and at least the emotional problems, the emotional dysfunction, has something to do with our inability to perceive the role that we play in the broader context of the problem. And the broader context of the problem inevitably involves interpersonal relationship and the degree of maturity that we bring to those interpersonal relationships. So as the chronic anxiety goes up, as the acute anxiety goes up, as our emotional investment in the problem goes up, our ability to perceive the broader context, or even know that we only have a slice of the broader context, and our ability to see our own the role that our own functioning plays in the problem and potentially in causing the problem, for lack of a better word, actually decreases. We lose the ability to do that. So the prescription or the suggestion of both of these systems basically is two sides of the same coin. Apply scientific principles to understand the problem prior to controlling the problem. But the other side of the coin is to apply the same scientific principles to understanding our own functioning and the role that it is playing in our ability to solve the problem, or even in the problem itself. And so I have some examples of that coming. So that's the takeaway. That's what they're saying. They're separating out theory from control and saying that how you understand a problem prior to controlling it determines the action you take to solve it. And it seems to me that there is an implied determinism in there that goes all the way down to the bottom of biology, at least, where every action is determined by the expectation that the behavioral unit has for the context that it will confront, and that expectation is molded over time through evolution, and we're certainly continuing to mold it as we move forward. Now, the Buddha had words for this. The words I've been using so far are kind of Bowen-esque words. They're real similar to the type of language used in the Bowen literature, but the words that the Buddha used were avijja paccaya sankhara. Avijja paccaya sankhara. And what that means, it's the very first entry point that you would describe Vipassanā theory if you're going to give it in a condensed form. And it means avijja means ignorance. Vijja is wisdom. And so in this context, it's, even though those words might be a little vague, what it means is it's the expectation or the amount of error, it's the accuracy or error in the theory, in the expectation that the behavioral unit has for the context that it will be confronted with. So the amount of error in the theory that leads to action, avijja. Paccaya, causes or conditions or gives rise because of or arises because of action. So the action, sankhara, the action is determined by the match between the theory and the context. So the predictive power, the accuracy in the theory itself and the context that it confronts. That's the adaptation variable. It's not a very big leap deductively to arrive at that conclusion. But it's saying that this is paramount. And so humans have the ability to actually update our program, whereas other less complex forms of life, it takes many, many, many more generations and hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to be able to actually make a change in that theory and the expectation that the environment will have. But we can actually update ours fairly quickly, at least at the superficial level, at the intellectual level, at the cultural level, and then we also have the ability to change it at the much deeper, supposedly more hardwired level, and that's what the practice of Vipassanā is for, and so I'll go into that later. So in this third section, so these were the sort of condensed, inferred, paradigmatic markers that I pulled out of the, Bowen literature. So I did a pretty comprehensive review of the Bowen literature, of the seminal literature, let's say, or the literature that captured these guidelines, and it seemed to me like there was some kind of a pattern, although it wasn't quite condensed well enough, and so I did my best to do that without sacrificing any precision. And so these may not be correct, but they seem to work pretty well so far. So I'll see how they hold up over time. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So these are ways to organize a theory of a problem. That's what I mean by models. So this is going back to what I was just saying. The way or the expectation that the behavioral unit has for the environment is the theory. It's the prediction that would be made for what the environment will be in any case. That's the theory. And so the way you organize the theory, the way that the theory is worded, the way it's thought about, is the suggestion is that it's best improved by following these guidelines. So this is more or less an attempt at capturing what is described as systems thinking, I would say, the way Bowen defined it. Okay, so the first one is accounting for all observations. And what this means is that you are not prioritizing some observations over others. So the marker for this, the test, is whether or not you're getting into statistical thinking. And the function of statistics, the purpose of statistics, is literally to measure the degree to which the observations match a preconception. The central tendencies, the mean, median, mode, etc., max, they represent the preconception of the observer imposed on the observational facts, the neutral facts. And so what this means is that you maintain some kind of patience in order to only describe what is observed and not imply something that hasn't been observed yet, as you do in statistics. So that means no normal, no abnormal. Everything is a product of nature. And so in a distribution, a statistical distribution, you literally have a measurement that says how normal an observation, any one observation, is. So the example from Bowen's original research project, where he had a mothers and daughters in the psychiatric ward, and was treating and observing them over time and trying to figure out how they worked, not just how to improve their symptoms. The daughters were on the extreme end of psychotic, so far as I understand it. So one of the things that they noticed on the ward was that when the daughter would get into a helping position for the mother, let's say the mother was hospitalized, then the symptoms in the daughter would decrease and maybe disappear. And then when the mother pulled up and was able to take care of herself a little more, the daughter didn't necessarily need to be in the helping position or couldn't be in the helping position, then her symptoms would come back, and it was so predictable that the ward staff actually prepared for it when it happened. Now, if this happened every time, then the model would be that there's some kind of a seesaw, reciprocal relationship between the mother and the daughter, where neither one can be up at the same time, and that they actually change predictably in relationship to each other. So simply saying that when one changes, the other changes in the opposite direction is an observation and a model that avoids statistics. So accounting for all observations, everything is a product of nature. Everything is natural. Not ignoring observations. That's another way to say that. Not ignoring observations so that you can keep the model. It's challenging the model with every observation that comes in. Okay, the second one is describe processes and not simply content. There's a lot here. So this means that the words in the model, that the model actually is a process. It describes a process. And I had a clinical example for this where I was working in a medical clinic, and a mother of a 10-year-old daughter brought her daughter in for nail biting. She was biting her nails until they bled, and the medical staff would treat the pain, but of course there's no cure in their arsenal to stop the nail biting. That's where psychiatry comes in, or psychology. And so I did a 20-minute behavioral health interview. I did a 20-minute assessment, just the timeline of the symptom and the relationship context, so getting a broader sense of what was going on. And the mother's theory actually changed along this dimension. That means that, in this case, it went from, oh, it's been this way all the time and it's never changed, please fix it, to, well, I guess it actually got pretty bad like a year ago, and that was when when it really got worse, and that was the same time that I broke up with my abusive boyfriend, and we had to flee the state, and she was really attached to his parents. So this is a different description. It's a description of how things changed over time as opposed to just what it is, which is a static description and leads to a symptom relief type of action. So that's a type of a model, a theory that leads to a certain kind of action. It conditions the outcome, just like I was saying before. It conditions the action. And it turns out that, so she scheduled a few sessions, and a few sessions later she came back and wasn't even interested in talking about the nail biting because her theory had changed. The way she understood the problem had changed enough to where she reprioritized what we were talking about, because it was obvious that the way that she was managing the relationships and the anxiety that was going on, the reactivity, was funneling down into the daughter, and that was the only way that the daughter knew how to deal with it. And not only that, but the actual symptom changed just from her mother's perspective on the problem in the first place. It decreased, and I think it actually went away. No, that one did go away. That symptom disappeared, which is a remarkable change for something that had been there for 3 years total. Okay, number 3, account for concurrent reciprocation. So, concurrent reciprocation is my term, the best way that I can describe what is effectively chaos theory, complex systems, so chaotic behavior. And as an example, if you have a two planetary system, a two-body gravitational system, and you're trying to model the effect of one on the other in a feedback loop, right? You can actually do that in a stepwise linear causal cause and effect model, where the first one affects the second one a little bit, the second one affects the first one a little bit, and then the first one affects the second one a little bit, and you sort of simulate it like that, and then they rotate properly. However, when you add in a third body, then it's a different situation, because as soon as the first one has affected the second one, the third one has affected both of them, and vice versa. So it's a completely different problem, and a linear model doesn't work. It's you have to use a different kind of modeling technique, a different way of thinking about what's happening altogether. So it's concurrent reciprocation because we have reciprocal feedback loops that are actually running concurrently. And I took these terms from computer science, my experience as a software engineer, because it used to be that you had one processor, one CPU on the computer, and you could actually only run one program at a time. It was like if you had an office with one person, and they could only work on one task at a time. But they were simulating the fact that there were multiple things going on. And so they would have different windows for different applications that were doing different things. That's one example. And they were actually functioning at the same time. But the way it did that was the processor just switched between running each process for a little bit at a time, so that it appeared that they were running simultaneously. But really it was doing multitasking, is what we call it with people anyway. So it was like keeping the plates spinning. And then when they started adding multiple CPUs, then you could actually have more than one program running at the same time. Literally. And it was it was a total paradigm shift. It's a different kind of problem, because once you set off a couple of programs running at the same time, you have to have a way for them to communicate, especially if they both have to access the hard drive at the same time. Well, you can only have one of them do it at the same time, and so you have to have a way to communicate, but you can't predict when each program is going to get to the end of its little job it's doing, and it's just it's an incredibly difficult paradigm to work in. But the paradigm concurrent processing, concurrency, is practically a discipline in itself. So it's concurrent reciprocation in that respect. There's actually two things happening at the same time, even if they're mutually influencing each other. Number 4 is describe a change in one variable as a change in another variable. This means literally that the words to describe a variable describe change in another variable. So that means not describing one variable on its own. And what this does is it keeps the scope of the system it keeps the whole system in scope, in view. So the counterexample would have been if Bowen had simply described the symptoms in the daughter. Say she has this, it seems like she has this category of schizophrenia or something like that, and she, the words that she's saying is this, and she's always dreaming about this, and just focusing on that one variable, the functioning of the daughter, as opposed to saying, when the daughter's functioning goes down, the mother's functioning goes up. And when the mother's functioning goes down, the daughter goes up. That's actually a different kind of description. And so the way to think about it is that a variable literally is change in another variable. So that's even a little deeper than saying it's described as change in another variable. A variable is change in another variable. So I have a demonstration for this. Forgot to get this going before I started, but that's okay. Let's see. So this is just a demonstration I built to prove a point. This is a systems model. This has the characteristics of a systems model, I would say. The idea for this clicked for me finally when I was reading Michael Kerr's article. I think it was either 1980 or 1984 on a systems model for disease. It was in the Family Center report. And he was talking about the way that he was beginning to conceptualize his acne symptoms as a multivariate problem, but not just a multi-causal problem, a situation where there are many factors that represent an equilibrium that hold the functioning or his functioning more or less in an equilibrium. And so a systems model describes how an equilibrium is maintained. That's the key. So as an example, in this demonstration, I've got 5 variables, and right now the value for the variables are all 0, and they add up to the total in the lower right-hand corner, and when the total is 0, the system's in equilibrium. So if I increase this variable, first variable, you can see the value increasing down there, lower right-hand corner, and the total of all 5 variables is positive, so it's out of equilibrium. And then if I bring this second one down just enough, then we're back to equilibrium, back at 0, and so on. So the systems model defines how the variables hold it in an equilibrium. So an example for that would be, if I change the first one, like I did just a minute ago, the systems model would determine which variables change in response and how much. That's its job. That's what it does. So how does it know if it's this one, or this one, or this one, or this one that changed? And how does it know how much? That's the question for the model. That's the question the model solves. And what's interesting is I really wanted to make this an actual real-time behaving model, so that when I changed a variable, the other ones would automatically pull the system back in equilibrium. And I thought, oh, that'll be kind of a fun little thing to just sort of bang out. And it actually turns out to be an incredibly difficult problem. It's easy enough to have a simple algorithm that says when this one goes up, just push the next one down the same amount. But that's not a very interesting model. An interesting model would account for how all the variables would hold the system in equilibrium at once. So once you get into that 3-body problem, and say you want to account for how 3 variables hold the system in equilibrium, then that becomes a very difficult thing to model. Even if it's random, even if you're not representing something in nature. So then you can imagine if it's hard to even make a fake one, then it must be really hard to make a model that actually predicts the behavior of something in reality, in nature. But nevertheless, the description of one variable literally is change in another variable, and the model describes how the variables hold the system in equilibrium. I was thinking that number 4 could potentially be subdivided into 2 more, where you've got one that says describe a change in variable as change in another, and then the other one is that the model describes an equilibrium. But this is fine for now. Number 5 is relate each variable to all other variables. This is basically just internal consistency. It's saying that the whole model has to function as a whole. And the counterexample to that is when you have a model that's fragmented and the pieces can't talk to each other. So let's just say if we're developing a weather model and there's one specialist who only studies the rain, one who only studies clouds, and one who only studies humidity, and one who only studies oceans. So if they can't talk to each other, then you don't have a cohesive system. So it has to work as a whole. And the test for that might be if a person who doesn't know the model can come and walk up and say, how does this variable relate to this variable? And they pick them randomly. So if you've got that cohesive weather model and you say, well, what's the relationship between the ocean and the rain? What's the relationship between the humidity and the clouds? How do they fit together? Then you would be able to describe that. And so moving towards a systems model would be more like, well, we've got this concept called water. It unifies all of them into one model. Because they're all different manifestations of water. They're different states of water. And then we've got this other variable called temperature. And as the temperature goes up, the water evaporates into humidity, let's say, vapor, and then it condenses into clouds. And then when the temperature falls enough, it condenses even more and turns into rain. And then when it hits the ground, it runs downhill into the ocean. So we've got a process happening there that's described as a cohesive, coherent system where all the pieces have relationships. 6 is generate falsifiable predictions. This is a basic criterion of science. It was popularized by Karl Popper, and it basically is what anchors the systems model in the objective domain. So in all the other guidelines here, you can still be talking about subjective context, that concepts or variables that are untestable. And so how do you know that you're actually modeling something in reality? How do you know that your model is accurate to the context? It's an accurate expectation. You're able to set up an experiment that actually has a wrong answer. And so Popper's argument actually was that Freud and Adler had only proved that their theories, which were very interesting theories, very sophisticated conceptualizations, they had only proved that they could explain anything, not whether or not the explanations were correct. And so the criterion for that is that you can run an experiment that has a wrong answer, not just that it always has the right answer. And the example for that from Bowen's study, where there was the mother and the psychotic daughter. So if the mother had pulled up and out of the hospital and the staff had prepared for the onset of the symptoms in the daughter and they never came, then that would be an example of that prediction being false. It has a wrong answer. So the last one I like quite a bit because I'm a software engineer, and it seems like software engineers are kind of, well, maybe just serious ones or experienced ones, or maybe not, maybe just certain kinds of software engineers are caught up in the project of choosing the right terms to describe whatever it is that's being built. And so this is also something that seems to exist in the culture surrounding Bowen theory, which is interesting, and to some degree in the culture surrounding Vipassanā theory. So the guideline here is to use terms, to choose the words that describe what is being observed or predicted, using terms that are not dependent on the human species. And so an example of that, a test of that would be, does anger or depression or happiness or whatever, any of the feeling words, apply? Do they accurately describe behavior in humans, plants, or ants, then plants, then electrons? Humans, ants, plants, and electrons. And you can choose your own choice, but the point of that is to go all the way down through biology, all the way down to the smallest units of matter. And there are ways to do that sort of thing, I think. But the other guidelines seem to make it a little easier to do this. When you start talking about processes, that helps. You know, when you're talking about change in one variable leading to change in another variable, that helps, that kind of thing. So anyway, these are, the title of the slide is Guidelines for Natural Systems Models. I think that they might actually work for examining the accuracy or the sophistication in a theory of any complex problem. And then, of course, if you're doing that, that means you're actually taking a step back from choosing among the array of potential solutions for the problem to how the problem is understood prior to intervention. So what is the broader context of the nail biting? What is the broader context over time, and what are the variables that that influence each other, that impact this symptom, and et cetera, et cetera. It seems like you don't have to actually make this kind of a system, this kind of a meta model or meta theory for studying natural systems that don't pertain to humans. If you're studying whales or you're studying the weather, maybe it's easier, but it seems like we need some kind of a set of guidelines to stick by when we're developing theories about how people work. So that's what this is for. I've already noticed some interesting applications for this. In preparing for my defense, I was thinking through some of the psychological models that my committee might use as comparisons to say, well, how is this model not what you're talking about? And I automatically started using these guidelines and going through these guidelines to come up with a more objective answer to the different paradigm that Bowen theory exists in, or a theory that assumes emotional systems exists in, and any other model, and to see, well, how well do they fit together, how well can they inform each other, and that sort of thing. So you can certainly use it for the DSM. I was using it for the RDoC. I was using it for the HiTOP, the hierarchical diagnostic model. That's an interesting one. Those are all diagnostic models, but I mean, I think you can apply it to anything. The attachment theory would be a really good one. Psychodynamic theory obviously would be good, although that might be kind of easy. You could go with any of the third wave behavioral therapies, any of the group models, and then develop some way to understand how they may or may not relate to Bowen theory. So the point was in the study was to develop this rubric so I could compare it with Vipassanā theory to see how well, if Vipassanā theory had this compatibility that I was intuiting with Bowen theory, and it turned out that there's enough of it that does actually exemplify these guidelines well enough to where I concluded that the evidence suggests that they're in the same frame of reference. They at least can inform each other and have the same conversation. And they both distinguish themselves from therapy in the same way, and that it's about increasing understanding of what's happening for these complex, particularly for emotional complex problems, and not just trying to change it. All right. In the fourth section, the final section, I'm going to move beyond the paradigm level now. So all up to this point, I've been talking about the broader context that theories are developed in and that a natural system theory might be developed in. So now I'm going to get more specific about theoretical concepts in both of these theories and how they may interact with each other. How to relate what Vipassanā theory says about how people work and other living things as well with what Bowen theory says about how people and other living systems work. Now that's something that doesn't happen that often, I think. At least at the broad level, it seems like people who are interested in Bowen theory often enough relate what is described in a specific area of research with what is described in Bowen theory. That Bowen theory is the framework that you would hang lots of specific findings on, but it's a different type of task to compare such a rich integrative theory like Bowen theory with another theory. such a theory exists. And psychoanalytic theory is certainly one example of one more subjective, less falsifiable theory that can integrate observations from many domains, but of course it's unfalsifiable. So this is a challenge that seems to come up all the time, at least from my limited experience in the Bowen network and listening to people talk and reading the literature, reading Bowen's commentary, that there's a desire to compare different therapeutic systems with Bowen theory and even different theoretical systems with Bowen theory, although maybe not quite as often, and that is a difficult task. And so how best to go about that? I think so far I've captured my best effort at my best understanding on how to understand the difficulty in doing that and to assess whether it's even possible. So that would be captured in the assumption of theory dictates action, and that there's a difference between theory and intervention, the engineering versus science perspective, and then also the way to develop or organize a theory or model, in particular in the natural systems paradigm. I think that accounts for that difficulty. So moving on from that into the specific theoretical domain, I'm going to talk about some aspects of what may go into a ninth concept of Bowen theory, but I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting or proposing a ninth concept. I'm in no position to do that. But it seems like it seemed to me that when I was trying to figure out what contribution Vipassanā theory might make to Bowen theory or vice versa, or at least how to even relate what they were saying about how people work together, that I started to see some potential for a broader contribution in the form of an additional concept. So let's just say that an additional concept of Bowen theory, now there's 8 concepts in Bowen theory, and let's say that a ninth concept could at least account for the cultural level or the phenomenal level, the subjective experience, let's say, of a human in the context of natural system theory in the same frame of reference. So the trying to resolve the problem where there are stories and ideas and phenomenal experiences that people talk about, such as religion, such as spiritual experiences, etc., that we tend to talk about as if they exist in a different domain of reality, and trying to understand how to relate those experiences or those the content of those experiences, more or less, with a natural systems theory or with the natural systems paradigm. So that's not actually trying to prove or disprove whether or not God exists, for example, or whether or not someone's dream is factual, but the fact that they had it and the function that plays in human adaptation, human behavior, let's say. Okay, so what is Vipassanā saying about how people work? So it's got a basic model for all living things. This is very oversimplified, but it's helpful for the conversation. Vipassanā's theory is saying that a way to understand how living systems behave is that there is some kind of sensory input. There's information from the context coming from outside the organism and from within the physical structure of the organism, but that this information is practically neutral, more or less neutral. So let's just call it factual. And then there is some system inside the organism that processes that neutral information in order to discriminate between the indefinitely numerous behavioral pathways available to that organism every single moment of its life. So there's numerous pathways, and that function functions to discriminate between those pathways, to choose. Now, for example, I'm talking right now. I could stop, I could talk faster, I could walk out the room and leave the video running. There's a million different things that I could do. There's uncountable number of behavioral pathways I could take in this moment, and in this moment, and in this moment, and in the next moment, and the next moment, etc. The function of that system is to discriminate between those pathways in real time as it moves through time. So Vipassanā is accounting for or offering a conceptualization for how this thing works. Vipassanā theory is saying that it functions by assigning or imposing value. It evaluates that neutral data, that factual data that comes in from the environment and is coming in from the physical structure of the organism. It evaluates it. So it adds value to the neutral information in the form of positive and negative valence. I like it, I don't like it. Desirability valence plus intensity. How much I like it or how much I dislike it. So we've got value that's being generated through a biological mechanism. It's inherent in life that sets up a value hierarchy that is used to guide behavior. That you're going towards the good and you're going away from the bad, and that it's highly complex. That there are this is occurring in great detail, and within that functional system that does the discrimination, that there are many conflicting values, if you will, that are being generated, and that the actual behavior outcome is kind of like the product. It's the aggregate of all of those values combined together at once. So that's not anything new. That's not a novel contribution. The idea of a hierarchy of values has been around for a little while. The valence, the RDoC research domain criteria for research I understand has a valence dimension. We're talking about valence assignment in the emotion literature, and but in the model that I'm throwing out here, we've got value as an informational component that is a representation. It is the product of the theory in that general sense that I was talking about that guides the behavior of the organism. It is the organism's expectation of the environmental context. So that information comes in, and then the theory determines or predicts the behavioral pathway based on its understanding of the problem, which is represented in that contextual information, that input, that initial input. So we've got a very broad definition of value here that extends beyond the human domain. We have a functional system that is more universal than just humans, so some kind of a universal definition of psychology. And honestly, I actually am not aware of an objective, more precise definition of psychology. It seems kind of vague and when it's described in terms of humans, but we've got it as that which discriminates from behavioral pathways based on context. And Vipassanā is suggesting that it does that by assigning value, which is desirability, valence, positive or negative plus intensity. So this isn't anything new, but the Buddha made a particular contribution that is not represented in its entirety in the literature even yet. A lot of it is, but not all of it. He's saying that as this system functions, as this evaluation system functions, you can actually observe it working and learn how it works by observing the physical sensations that manifest on your body that emerge, that arise prior to action, but are the initial impulse for gross action, and that as sensation emerges on the body, anywhere on the body, throughout the body, in great detail and great resolution, it always has a valence. That's what he was saying. That it's sensation that is the central conduit that all phenomenal experience passes through, including thinking. Thinking is actually an organ in that system. It's a sense organ. So you've got sound coming in through the ears, sound coming in through the eyes. You've got sensation as a sense on its own coming from the body, tangible sensation. you've got taste and smell. You also have thoughts, which are some kind of like informational feedback loop or something like that. But at any rate, all of these are processed as that neutral sense data, and then there is an evaluation that assigns value to the data, and then the very next step is the triggering of a sensation on the body, which is still just the information stage. It's the physiological representation of the value, which is determined by the theory, let's say. And then it's the sensation, it's the value that determines the action. So you'll get if you do the practice of Vipassanā long enough, and it really does take a lot of work to get to this point. This isn't something that the average person can do and sit down and just start observing the functioning of that system through sensation, necessarily. You've got to practice, and you've got to sharpen your perception and get your perception to a subtle and complex, sophisticated level enough to be able to even feel your entire body, and to be able to feel it simultaneously, so that you can see how value is being generated in the form of sensation throughout the complex network of systems inside and out on the outside of your body, and how they all function together as one cohesive unit. How they're competing for each other. This value versus this value. I'm tired, but I also want to eat, but I also need to do this, and I also have this errand, and I have to decide, right? But my heart keeps pumping all the while, so there's certain value-laden impulse that's doing that as well. So, this is all prior to action. This is at the information level. This is describing a psychological system in the sense that there is a decision made. It's a decision network. The entire body is implicated in this decision network. And you don't have to go far for evidence for that. If I'm having this talk and I'm having this relatively sophisticated conceptual lecture right now, and if I were to get up and try to grab something and then stub and break my toe, the pain from the toe would override my ability to keep on talking. And so that is reorganizing the hierarchy of functional systems in my body, psychological and physiological, into another mode. It's dominated and taken over. That value has won. This hurts, and that's bad, and it would be good to remedy the situation. And then I come up with all these thoughts on how to remedy it. So we have an emergent value system that inherent in biology, that it guides behavior. It's an aspect of function in biology, not just structure, although it emerges from structure. So that's Vipassanā. The word for this in the Pali that the Buddha used was Vedana Samo Sarana Sabitama. It was one of many passages that describes this. And basically what that means is that every thought that occurs in the mind, or every mental concomitant, has a sensation, a Vedana, that arises with this value-laden structure. And so that means that every single subjective experience, this is back to the ninth concept, every phenomenal datum, if you will, has with it a physiological marker that you can more or less observe objectively within your body. And that you can get better at observing them. You can be able to observe them more accurately, at greater detail, and in greater number concurrently, to see how all the feedback loops in your body are leading to your gross level behavior. So, I want to think if there was something else at this level before I wanted to move on. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Right, no, I got it. So there is one more piece, and that's that, and this is just repeating what I said before. So the suggestion is that humans have the unique capacity to observe this functioning working. And that's the process of Vipassanā. That's the methodology of Vipassanā, is that you sit down and you learn what's happening without trying to intervene. And as soon as you sit down and stop moving, you're changing the habit pattern of your mind, because they're used to having all this stimulation going on through all of your sense organs. And when you start shutting those down and start focusing on your body, you're closing a feedback loop, and it starts reacting. And it's the ability to inhibit the desire to react and see what all of these impulses are, as opposed to what you actually interpret them as. So the impulse has some kind of interpretation, like, oh, my knees hurt, and that's really bad, and this isn't going to be good for me, and I should get up and leave. Well, upon deeper examination, more objective, and a more rigorous experiment where you're giving it more time with less reaction, and you can sit through the pain, you might start to realize the pain isn't actually what you thought it was. That's certainly a common anecdote. So humans have the ability not just to update the theory that leads to the generation of values at the intellectual level, but that you can actually change the deeper, more hardwired generation of value. You can change the theory by running this experiment and running this objective experiment called Vipassanā. So you're not instilling change, you're actually increasing the way that you understand the functioning of your physiology and psychology by doing a systematic, controlled scientific methodology to observe how it functions. And it's a very difficult practice, but that's the point. All right, so this is at the individual organismic level. This is what Vipassanā is describing. And just to give an example here, so this is the application of value occurring in your mind as you look at these two pictures. So on the left-hand side, we've got this boat going to this kind of heaven archetype type of thing, where we at least know that that's supposed to be nice and it's positive, right? We assign a positive valence. And then on the right, we have the same boat going through the boundaries of space into the void, where there's all these monsters waiting, and we know that that's supposed to be bad. So there's not only is there the same process I was describing, where the neutral information is coming in, and then it's being this value or evaluation is imposed onto it in real time, but there's some kind of congruence between the way I'm evaluating it and the way you evaluate it. At least you know which one is supposed to be good. And if this had some kind of an impact on our behavior right now, for example, if we're in a maze and one door looks like the left one and one door looks like the right one, then that would actually impact the behavioral pathway at a gross level that we would take. Might go towards the left one, although if you're feeling saucy, maybe you'd go for the right one. Who knows? Okay. So, Bowen theory comes in here and provides this very, very interesting biological concept, or concept to biology, rather, that I think allows the model that Vipassanā is suggesting to scale to across levels of analysis. So from the cellular level to the organic level, to the individual level, the personal level, to the familial, the social, and beyond. And the concept is called an emotional system. So now I've got a particular definition of emotion here that is not necessarily congruent with the psychological literature. Usually when we mean emotions, we mean the feelings we have as humans. And so I'm going to make a distinction here that is not anything new to the Bowen literature. It's basic to the Bowen literature, and that's that emotion in this sense is simply the energy for action. So the E prefix in Latin actually comes from ex, which means external, outside. So it's emotive action means energy for movement, which always has something to do with outside. It's not a collapse into inside, into internal, let's just say subjective, or information-oriented processes internal to the organism. It's actually motion. So that's a more universal definition because it can apply to plant life just as well as human life. Now, the emotional system describes that which is predictable in the way that, now I'm using my terms, these emergent value systems coordinate. So an emotional system maintains itself as a system by coordinating its members to function for the group. And so the overlap in the emergent value systems and the individual components of the system, say the different people in the system, they overlap in the positive, where we all agree that this particular behavior, this cultural mores, whatever, is positive, and so that's guiding the behavior of the group. which of course has its variation in the individual level because the individuals are constantly coming in and out of line with the group in terms of the value that they're following. So an emotional system is that which is predictable in the coordination of the group. The emotional system functions to regulate its members to ensure the survival of the group. However, the counterbalancing force at play there is that each organism simultaneously has to function for itself, because if it completely devotes itself to the group, then it won't survive. So for example, if I stay up for days and days and months on end petitioning my congressperson for some political faction, for society, or for the greater good, or however I want to conceptualize it, and I don't eat, and I don't go to the bathroom, etc., then I'm going to not survive. So I'm talking about the most basic level here. There's always a dilemma between functioning for self, functioning for group. Similarly, if I only function for self and I just pull from the group, then I've got that free rider dilemma, and the emotional system in part functions to prevent that. It has various mechanisms for that. So Bowen theory describes the family in particular as one kind of emotional system, but the concept extends beyond the family and into the individual organism, where I was speaking in terms of emotional systems in the previous slide, where there's an emergent value system, where there's many, many values generated concurrently within my body, within my psychology, that are competing more or less, and then my gross behavior is the aggregate outcome of those, the aggregate product of the combination of those values. And then the same process is occurring at the social level, at the familial level, the social level, and on a national level, etc. So that's a very interesting concept. It provides a different view on dealing with important complex problems. And so here's an example, and this type of example is nothing new for people who know Bowen theory, but let's say you've got three people who need to decide where to have a Christmas party, a fairly mundane issue, and one person starts the conversation saying, well, so how about this place over here, but I don't really like their bathrooms, though, that's the thing. And then the other person says, in response to the first one, in relation to the first one, that's the key that I'm going to come back to over and over. So the second one, in response to that, says, yeah, but, I'm not sure if it's in our budget. And then the third person, in response to what both of them said, yeah, but their room is really great. So we've got a negative for the bathrooms, we've got a negative for the budget, and then we've got a positive for the room. So we have these values that are emergent in the coordination of the system. We've got an emotional system that is where there's this negotiation of values going on, let's say, evaluative systems going on. So Bowen theory describes how systems progress and regress in the sense that they're able to solve problems more effectively or less effectively. So let's just say that the challenge of this particular problem, of this particular issue, increases beyond the capacity of those three individuals to coordinate. So the pressure of the survival, in the broader sense, is greater than the organism or the social group can adapt. So what might happen is that the bathroom person might dig into their position a little bit more, and they might get a little more anxious, and their field of view, like I was saying in the beginning, might narrow, and they might lose the broader context that their theory is becoming more simple of the problem. It simply becomes about the opposing side, which is the budget side. They're both digging into their position. They're both regressing into a more basic form of behavior that is more aligned to simple and maybe even forceful action, but the theory behind that has become less sophisticated. It's simply that the other person is wrong, not the complex interactions of all of the variables involved in the particular issue. So now it's become about the other person. So what's interesting is that if the third person can pop out by, say, some stroke of luck and notice that and start observing the two positions, they might notice that there's actually a counterbalancing relationship between the way that one value position manifests and the way that another value position manifests. So this is getting out of the particular value itself, the content of the value, the bathroom versus the budget. It's getting out of that and it's looking on a different dimension. So it's a different variable entirely. It's that this variable digs in because this variable digs in. You know, that this value lets up a little bit and becomes interested in the other value, and the other value position does the same in response. And if there is any kind of reciprocal relationship between those two, then you might be able to kick back and pull out, derive different pathways for action. And of course, the suggested pathway for action is for if anyone can develop a more accurate theory of the situation and address all sides as objectively as possible, and as appropriately as possible, but more importantly, address the emotional system that's at work. And so the emotional system is what is actually making that relationship happen. It's built into the species. There's something automatic where one person digs in, the other person likely will have an automatic reaction to do the same. And that when one lets up and becomes more interested in the other side, the other one automatically becomes more interested as well. And this is an oversimplification just for this case that we got these two poles working like that. But the emotional system is the predictability in the way the parts relate to each other, not just what they're saying, but how they're manifesting. And so going back to avijja paccaya sankhara, where the Buddha is saying it's the theory, it's the accuracy of the theory, or rather it's the theory that gives rise to action, it's the accuracy in the theory, how well it matches the actual context that determines the efficacy of the action. That's the adaptability variable. So a more sophisticated theory of the emotional system, according to Bowen theory, is going to be the most important variable to at least account for, especially in the long run. And what's interesting, if you get into the collective behavior and intelligence literature, they're starting to discover how biological systems coordinate in relation to each other, where the individual components are actually extremely incapable compared to the computational power of the total emotional system, where all the parts are doing this sort of negotiation dance, like when I was talking about deliberating over where to have the Christmas party. There's something in the way that the interactions work where the sum is much greater than the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. And they're measuring that in terms of, for example, the computational power of certain fish to evade predators might be greater than that of a primate. The school of fish, because they're massively concurrent, each fish is moving a little bit in relation to the other fish in real time, and there's this constant real-time consideration of many variables from many fish and many angles at the same time, that whole school has an incredible computational capacity as a unit, but that each individual fish is really not that intelligent. So not accounting for the emotional system could not just lead to undesirable results and lead to solutions that make solutions based on partial theories that make things worse in the long run, like winning the argument of the budget or winning the argument of the bathroom, but that there's something in the effective coordination of the disparate values, using my term, that has some kind of a greater computational power when put together. So that's the presentation. Those are just a few aspects of the total study, and I had to condense it down, to get into a 45-minute presentation. Although this one I elaborated on some things quite a bit more, so it's a bit longer. But I hope that made sense, and thanks for watching. And just a simple example of that is that if I want, I have some kind of a force that